forest was still that night, too still. Not the kind of peaceful quiet you'd expect in the wilderness, but a heavy, suffocating silence that seemed to press against your ears, making you acutely aware of every breath you took. Even the usual forest chorus chirping crickets, distant owls, rustling branches was missing, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. 4 college friends had set up camp in a clearing they'd stumbled across after a long day of hiking. The clearing was perfect flat ground, open enough for their tents, yet surrounded by towering pines that seemed to rise endlessly into the sky. They'd laughed around the fire earlier, roasting marshmallows, trading stories, and daring each other to explore the tree line. But when the fire burned down to glowing embers, the atmosphere shifted. One by one, the friends drifted into sleep. The night was warm enough that the thin nylon tents felt like flimsy barriers against the darkness. But exhaustion had a way of drowning out unease. Sometime past midnight, Tyler stirred awake. He didn't know what roused him at first. It wasn't a dream, nor the chill of the night air. Then he heard it crunch, soft, deliberate footsteps. At first, told himself it was one of his friends sneaking out to relieve themselves in the woods. He waited, expecting the sound to fade as they wandered farther away, but it didn't fade. It circled, slowly, carefully, almost calculating. Tyler's heartbeat quickened as he lay frozen in his sleeping bag, staring at the faint outline of the tent fabric above him. The sound wasn't hurried. It wasn't clumsy. Whoever or whatever was out there was moving with purpose. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay silent. He didn't want to call out, didn't want to alert whoever was outside that he was awake. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, silence was unbearable. Tyler strained his ears, his breath shallow when a new sound reached him. A faint, almost inaudible exhale, like someone standing inches away from the thin tent wall, listening. Then, a shadow, distorted by the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the trees. It stretched across the fabric of the tent, a tall figure, unmoving, watching. Tyler's throat tightened. He wanted to scream to wake the others, but something deep inside told him not to, as if making a sound would confirm his presence, would invite the figure closer. Minutes crawled by. The shadow shifted slightly, then disappeared. Tyler lay in the darkness, wide-eyed, his body stiff with fear. Sleep never came back to him. He listened the rest of the night, every creak of the forest magnified, until at last, the sky began to lighten dot. When dawn finally broke, relief washed over him. The figure had vanished. The forest seemed normal, again the distant chatter of birds returning, the sun piercing through the treetops. Tyler almost convinced himself it had been a nightmare brought on by exhaustion, until they found that footprints got large, bare, pressed deep into the dirt, circling every tent, not just once, but multiple times, as though whoever or whatever it was had walked around them again and again, studying them while they slept. The friends tried to laugh it off at breakfast, suggesting it might have been some hiker who had lost his shoes, or maybe a prankster, but the clearing was miles from the nearest trail, and the footprints were too large, too deliberate. Tyler didn't laugh. He hadn't imagined the shadow. He hadn't imagined the breath, and deep down, he knew the truth. They hadn't been alone in the woods that night. Someone had been watching, and whoever it was had no intention of being seen. The lake was beautiful that evening, a sheet of silver stretching endlessly under the pale glow of the moon, surrounded by the dark embrace of towering pines. The couple had driven hours to reach it, desperate to escape the noise of the city. They wanted peace, the kind of silence only nature could offer, and for a while, that's exactly what they had. They pitched their tent near the water's edge, cooked a simple meal, and sat by a crackling fire as night fell. The air was cool but gentle, carrying the earthy scent of wet leaves and pine needles. It was the kind of night that felt almost too perfect, where even the smallest ripple on the lake looked like a painting. But perfection doesn't last. It started with a sound, a scream. It ripped across the water so suddenly, so violently, that both of them froze mid-conversation. It was high-pitched drawl, filled with panic. There was no mistaking it for an animal. It was human. A voice torn apart by terror. The scream echoed from across the lake, bouncing off the trees and fading into the night. For a long moment, they just sat there, staring at each other, waiting for it to happen again. And then it did. This time, louder, closer, as if whoever was screaming was running, moving rapidly through the trees, their voice climbing higher and higher into hysteria. The couple stood, their fire crackling behind them, eyes locked on the darkness beyond the lake. The screams weren't distant anymore. They were near, too near. Then, silence. The abruptness of it was worse than the sound itself. One moment, the air was alive with panicked cries. In the next, it was smothered in silence, so complete it felt unnatural. No wind, no rustling leaves, not even the soft lapping of the water against the shore. The woman gripped her partner's arm so tightly her nails dug into his skin. He whispered that it had to be a prank, someone trying to scare them. But even as he said it, he didn't believe it. There was no one else for miles. They were utterly alone, or at least they thought they were. Unable to shake the unease, they threw more wood on the fire, letting the flames flare higher. Trying to push back the suffocating darkness, they sat close, too afraid to retreat into the fragile safety of their tent. Hours crawled by. Every sound, every crack of a twig, every distant rustle made them flinch. And then, just as exhaustion was setting in, the silence broke again, not with a scream this time, but with laughter, faint, towel-like, echoing across the lake. It was worse than the screams. The sound was thin, hollow, and wrong, like something trying to imitate a laugh without ever having known what joy sounded like. The couple clung to each other, their breaths shallow, their fire now their only shield against the unknown. The laughter faded, and once again, the night swallowed everything. They didn't sleep, not a second. They sat by the fire until the first gray light of dawn bled into the sky. Only then did they dare to move. As they packed their gear, the woman walked to the shoreline to rinse a pan in the water. That's when she saw it. Floating near the rocks was a backpack, dark, waterlogged, torn in strange, jagged ways. She pulled it from the water with shaking hands, mud and lakeweed clinging to it. The fabric was shredded, not like it had been cut, but as if something had clawed through it. Inside were clothes, damp, filthy, torn the same way as the pack, and beneath them a single shoe, the sole cracked, the laces frayed, still caked with dried mud. The couple left everything else behind and fled. They never spoke of the screams again, but sometimes, even years later, when they close their eyes at night, they still hear it. That raw, desperate scream echoing across the still water. And they know, whatever happened on that lake shore, they were never meant to see it. The mountain air was sharp that night, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes every breath sting just a little. Two brothers had hiked most of the day, winding along narrow trails until the sun began to sink behind jagged ridges. When they found a flat stretch of ground overlooking the valley, they decided it was the perfect place to camp. They set up their tents side by side, the orange nylon domes glowing faintly in the last rays of daylight. The younger brother, Daniel, joked about how they were like little capsules waiting to be swallowed by the night. His older brother, Marcus, rolled his eyes but smiled all the same. They cooked noodles on a small camp stove, ate by lantern light, and talked about old times. For a while, it felt like the world belonged only to them. The stars scattered across the sky like shards of glass, the wind whistling softly through the pines. By midnight, both were exhausted, They wished each other good night and zipped themselves into their tents. The forest settled into stillness, but sometime in the dark hours before dawn, Marcus awoke. At first, he wasn't sure why. The night was quiet, except for the steady groan of branches swaying overhead. Then he heard it, a dragging sound, heavy, gritty, low to the ground, like something being pulled across dirt and rocks. His pulse quickened. He sat up, straining his ears. The sound continued, rhythmic, steady, coming from just outside his tent. Slowly, he reached for the zipper and pulled it down just enough to peek out. What he saw froze him. Daniel's tent was moving, not collapsing, not shaking with the wind moving, sliding away from where it had been pitched, as if an invisible force was dragging it across the ground. Marcus's mouth went dry. He scrambled out of his tent barefoot, the cold earth biting into his skin, and shouted Daniel's name. No response. The tent scraped along the dirt, leaving a trail behind it, inching toward the tree line. Panic surged through him. He ran to the shifting tent and yanked the zipper open, but the inside was empty. The sleeping bag was there, unzipped, the flashlight, Daniel's pack, but no Daniel, and still the tent dragged on, as if something was pulling it toward the black maw of the forest. Marcus stumbled back, heart pounding, and then the sound stopped. The tent lay crumpled in the dirt just at the edge of the trees. The forest beyond was silent, swallowing the last echoes of movement. He searched. All night, he searched. His voice carried through the trees, growing hoarse, but only silence answered him. When daylight came, the forest looked almost ordinary. The trail in the dirt was clear, carved deep by the dragging of the tent. It stretched from their campsite into the woods and vanished among the roots. Authorities came. They combed the forest, dogs sniffing through the undergrowth, search parties calling Daniel's name again and again. For weeks, they scoured the mountains. Then, one afternoon, far down a ravine, a hiker stumbled across something tangled among rocks and branches. Daniel's tent, torn to ribbons, the fabric shredded in long, unnatural gashes, as if ripped apart by claws or knives. But of Daniel himself, there was nothing, no body, no bones, no sign of struggle, just the tent dragged miles away from where it had been pitched. Marcus never went back to the mountains, but sometimes when he closes his eyes at night, he hears it, again that grinding, dragging sound creeping across the dirt, and he wonders if his brother was ever in that tent at all, or if something else had crawled inside instead. It was supposed to be the perfect summer trip. A small family of father, a mother, and their teenage daughter decided to spend the weekend camping in a quiet forest about 3 hours from home. They wanted time away from the noise of the city, a chance to breathe fresh air, sit by a fire, and enjoy the kind of silence that only nature could offer. The day was peaceful. The forest seemed alive with birdsong and the rustling of branches in the warm breeze. The family hiked, skipped stones across a shallow stream, and laughed together as the father clumsily tried to set up the tent. By dusk, they were roasting hot dogs over the fire, telling stories, and watching the orange glow of the flames dance across the tree trunks. The night air was warm, and the forest seemed harmless, safe, almost inviting. But that sense of safety wouldn't last. It began when the daughter wandered a little too far from the camp. She had gone to collect extra sticks for the fire, humming quietly to herself as she scanned the ground. The moon was bright, spilling light across the clearing, and for a moment she felt calm. And she saw her, a woman standing just beyond the trees, still, silent, watching. The daughter froze, her hands trembling, the bundle of sticks slipping from her grasp. She couldn't make out the details at first, only the outline of a figure tall, thin, unmoving. Something about the posture was unnatural, stiff, as though the woman had been standing there for hours. The girl turned and bolted back to the campsite, heart pounding, her breath ragged as she stumbled toward the fire. Her parents looked up in surprise as she ran into the clearing. Pale and shaken, she tried to explain through gasps of breath, stammering about a woman in the trees. Her father immediately grabbed a lantern, but when he scanned the tree line, there was nothing there. It told her she must have imagined it, that maybe it was just a trick of the shadows, but the daughter didn't believe it. She swore she had seen someone standing there, watching. The night dragged on. The fire burned lower. The forest grew darker, and then the father saw it for himself. A shape, just beyond the firelight, a figure standing among the trees, motionless. His blood ran cold. He shouted, his voice carrying across the clearing. The figure didn't move. It didn't run. It just stood there, watching. The father raised the lantern and stepped forward, his heart hammering in his chest. As the light touched the figure, the woman came into view. She wore a pale dress that seemed to blend with the moonlight. Her posture was stiff, her head tilted slightly as though she was studying them. At first, the father thought her face was turned away, but when she stepped forward, the truth froze him in place. She had no face, no eyes, no nose, no mouth, only smooth, pale skin stretched across where her features should have been. The mother gasped and pulled her daughter close, whispering frantically for her not to look. The father stumbled backward, the lantern shaking in his grip. His first instinct was to run at the figure, to chase it away, to prove it wasn't real. But before he could move, the faceless woman retreated into the shadows, slowly, deliberately, and then she was gone. The family didn't speak for a long time after that. They huddled by the fire, too afraid to move, too afraid to even close their eyes. Every crack of the wood, every shift of the trees made them jump. At some point in the night, the father swore he heard soft footsteps circling their tent. The mother said she heard breathing, faint but steady, just outside the nylon walls. The daughter didn't hear anything because she refused to listen. She pressed her hands over her ears until the first light of dawn crept into the sky. The moment the sun rose, they packed their belongings and left the forest behind. They didn't stop for breakfast. They didn't look back. They never returned to that campsite. But sometimes, late at night, the daughter still dreams of the woman in the woods, the faceless figure standing silently in the tree line, waiting. And in those dreams, the woman doesn't stay still. She steps closer. He had always loved the solitude of the wilderness. While others camped in crowded sites near trails or lakes, he preferred to vanish deeper into the woods, miles from anyone, where the silence was complete and the night belonged only to him. For him, it wasn't about adventure. It was about escape. Escape from the noise, from the constant buzz of life. That evening had been no different. He had hiked until the sun dipped low and the forest floor turned dusky blue, then pitched his small tent in a clearing nestled among old pines. He cooked a modest meal on his portable stove, ate in silence, and listened to the wind drifting lazily through the treetops. By the time the fire smoldered into embers, the woods had grown impossibly still. He crawled into his tent, zipped it shut, and stretched out in his sleeping bag. The earth was firm beneath him, the nylon walls thin but familiar. He closed his eyes, listening to the gentle rhythm of his own breathing. It was comforting at first. Then came the sound, a faint scratching dot, soft, deliberate, brushing against the outside of the tent fabric. He froze, every muscle in his body tensing. It could have been anything, branches moving in the breeze, a raccoon nosing around his campsite. He told himself not to overreact, but the sound grew louder, closer, moving slowly along the wall of the tent. Scratch, drag, scratch. It circled him. He sat up, heart pounding, listening as the noise shifted from one side of the tent to the other. The dragging was the worst, low, heavy, like something was pulling itself across the dirt, closer and closer. He reached for his flashlight, flicked it on, and shone the beam at the nylon. The thin fabric glowed faintly, For a moment, the sound stopped. He held his breath, and the fabric NTED, as if a hand or something shaped like one pressed from the outside, stretching the nylon toward him. He jerked back, scrabbling in his sleeping bag, the flashlight shaking in his grip. The shape lingered for a heartbeat, then slid slowly across the wall, dragging toward the corner. Summoning his courage, he unzipped the flap in one swift motion and thrust the being into the clearing. Nothing. The forest stared back at him silent, empty, unmoving. No footprints, no rustling leaves, only darkness. Swallowing hard, he zipped the tent shut again, trying to convince himself it was his imagination. But deep down, he knew the sounds had been real. The pressure against the fabric had been real. Something had been out there. Sleep was impossible. He sat upright the entire night, every nerve on fire. And as the hours crawled by, the noises returned. Not constant, this time sporadic. A faint scrape here, a dragging noise there. Always close, always circling. At times, he thought he heard breathing, slow and uneven, as though something was crouched just beyond the thin wall, waiting. The longest hours of his life passed that way. Darkness, fear, that relentless sense that he was not alone. When the first gray light of dawn bled through the fabric, he dared to unzip the tent again. What he saw made his stomach twist. The ground around his campsite was scarred, deep grooves carved into the dirt, circling his tent again and again, not like animal tracks, not like footprints. These were drag marks, long, deliberate, though something heavy had pulled itself around and around him through the night. He packed quickly, barely breathing, stuffing his gear into his bag with trembling hands. He didn't look back as he fled the clearing, hiking as fast as he could until the forest thinned and the world felt alive again. He never camped alone after that night. ECOULDN, single quotes, because no matter how many times he tried to rationalize it, no matter how many times he told himself it had to have been an animal, he couldn't explain the way the tent wall had indented. He couldn't explain the breathing. And most of all, he couldn't explain why the drag marks had no beginning, thought, and no end.